Hey Rock Buddies, it's Papa. Hope you guys are doing great and having a fantastic summer. It's high summer here at the Minimalist Cottage and the cicadas are buzzing. The sun is baking down and I love it. We've been talking about the geologic history of the eastern United States, and we talked about the rifting of Rodinia during late Precambrian time. We talked about the Taconic orogeny, which happened in the Ordovician period. Then we talked about the Akkadian orogeny that happened during the Devonian period. Now we're going to talk about the last and final mountain building event or orogeny called the Alleghanian orogeny, which happened during Pennsylvanian time and Permian time. That would be about 330 million years ago to 300 million years ago, plus or minus. And as you know, once the Alleghanian orogeny was done, the supercontinent Pangaea was completely assembled. And in its turn, the supercontinent Pangaea began to rift apart during Triassic time, which was began about 250 million years ago, and it was completely rifted for sure by the end of Cretaceous, about 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs went kaput. I've already done a video on the Alleghanian orogeny, and I went back and looked at it, and it looks pretty good. So here's the link to it, and I'd like for you guys to take a look at that, and I'll also put a link to it in the description on this video. You can also get to it by going to the playlists on my channel here, the one called Geologic History of Georgia, and inside that playlist look for the one that's entitled the Alleghanian orogeny. What I'm going to do now is tell the story to you over again and try to add some things in this video, in this version of the Alleghanian, that I didn't put in the last one. So hopefully this video will be informative and entertaining, and if so, please subscribe to this channel. It helps me immensely. It encourages me to keep going and lets me know that my message is getting out there. So here we go, the Alleghanian orogeny. This funky Crayola crayon drawing that I did makes it look like there are only two continents on Earth, North America and Africa, but I did it to show you the relationship between the two as the Alleghanian orogeny was approaching. North America was rotated 90 degrees clockwise from its present position, and the eastern United States was laying right across the equator, and Africa was approaching from the south. So let's have a look at what the world climate was like during Pennsylvanian time when Pangaea was coming together. The important thing to note here is that the atmospheric oxygen content was 35% then versus about 20% now. Average temperature was 70 degrees Fahrenheit versus about 60 degrees Fahrenheit now. There was an equatorial or tropical climate because the eastern United States lay right across the equator. These unique conditions of atmospheric oxygen and temperature with the tropical climate enabled animals and insects to go berserk, and that's why you had these giant dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans. I don't even want to think about the mosquitoes. Yuck. So let's start out our Alleghanian orogeny adventure by looking at the eastern United States at the end of the Devonian Akkadian orogeny. As you will recall, the Akkadian microcontinent crashed into eastern United States from Virginia north and eroded all its sediments into the Catskill Delta. And that occurred inside the red circle. Then in part 2 of the Akkadian orogeny, all that material, or quite a lot of that material, slid southwest along the Brevard Fault Zone into its position inside the yellow circle. Now at around 330 million years ago, Africa is approaching, and it's just about to crash into eastern North America, right about at Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania. And this was not a subduction event. There was no more ocean crust left to subduct beneath Africa or eastern North America, because the Akkadian microcontinent had sucked it all up, and that's why the Akkadian microcontinent got so big. So no subduction. This was just a plain outright crashing event where Africa crashed into eastern North America and shoved itself up on top of eastern North America. So if there was no subduction involved in the Alleghanian orogeny, where did the huge giant Himalayan-sized Alleghanian mountains come from? Well, the shoving of Africa onto North America was like a giant bulldozer, and it pushed up tremendous mountains. The same thing is happening in India with the Himalaya mountains. India started off off the east coast of Africa and slowly but surely moved north, eating up ocean crust and growing larger until it hit Asia. And then it began to bulldoze and plow up the Himalaya mountains, and that's why we have ocean limestone at the top of Mount Everest. This picture shows you how that happened. First, Africa crashed at Pennsylvania, and then the whole African continent rotated clockwise, slowly but surely closing the gap between itself and North America about as fast as fingernails grow. And here we have the last stages of the Alleghanian orogeny as it applies to the eastern United States, when it was shoved up and pushed up maybe 200 miles across the North American continent. Now, you'll notice nothing happened north of Pennsylvania. From New York north, there was no Alleghanian orogeny. As a result, there are a lot of granite plutons up there from New York all the way through Maine that did not get metamorphosed by the Alleghanian orogeny into granite and ice. For example, in Acadia National Park, Maine, there's the Cadillac Mountain granite placed during the Akkadian orogeny. Now, usually when a island arc or a microcontinent or a giant continent like Africa approaches another continent, it pushes down on it, and the first sediment to appear that marks the beginning of the mountain building event is a dark gray or black, very fine shale. For the Taconic orogeny, the dark shale was the Martinsburg shale. For the Akkadian orogeny, it was the Marcellus shale. And for the Alleghanian orogeny, it was the Chattanooga shale. The Chattanooga shale is a very fine-grained, very dark shale layer that marks the beginning of the Alleghanian orogeny. It has minor radioactive characteristics, and it's found in Alabama, Arkansas, Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, and vicinity. The next major sediment on top of the Chattanooga shale was the Fort Payne Formation, which consists of some very silica-rich, limey chert that I did a video on a little earlier that you can look at. The Fort Payne chert formation happened in the earliest Mississippian time, and like the Chattanooga shale formation, it was in the deeper part of this foreland basin, the Four Deep, that was caused when the huge African continent was pressing down on eastern North America. In the much larger and much shallower part of this foreland basin, where very few clastic or mountain-oriented sediments were accumulated, a huge thick pile of limestone was laid down and accumulated. This huge pile of limestone that developed in the more shallower parts of the Alleghanian foreland basin is called Mississippian limestone in Georgia. That's what I call it. Up in central Appalachians, Virginia, Kentucky, etc., it's called the Greenbrier Limestone. Remember when I talked about how the African continent first crashed into North America at the state of Pennsylvania? Well, that crash was so big and so fast, limestone did not have a time to accumulate like it did in other parts of this foreland basin. Instead, a reddish sandstone and shale sediment that's called the Mauch Chunk Formation was deposited up in that area during the very latest Mississippian time. This is all getting kind of confusing, so let's just do a recap. The first thing that happened in late Devonian was the Chattanooga black shell that marked the beginning of the Alleghanian Orogeny. On top of that, in earliest Mississippian came the Fort Payne Chert. Both of these formations were deposited in the deeper part of the Foreland Basin that was closest to Africa. In later Mississippian time, the Mauch Chunk formation was deposited in or around the vicinity of Pennsylvania, and the Greenbrier Limestone was deposited in the shallower part of the Foreland Basin that was on the western side, away from Africa. Okay, rock buddies, you will remember the rifting of Rodinia and the rocks produced by that, the Taconic orogeny and the rocks produced by that, the Akkadian orogeny and the rocks produced by that. Well, when Africa crashed, it took all those rocks and pushed them up and across eastern North America about 200 miles. And it pushed them across and on top of the rift-to-drift sequence, which is sandstone, shale, and limestone on top. Alleghanian mountains rose up to Himalayan mountainsides. The erosion gradient got steep, and coarser sediments begin to rush and flow off of these mountains. This is a picture of the Amazon River Basin in South America. It's been turned upside down. And I did this to kind of illustrate what the Alleghanian mountain building event was like. In the very upper right corner, that pink stuff would represent the Alleghanian Himalayan-sized mountains. And you can see this Amazon-sized river basin that carried sediments into the Foreland Basin. The Amazon Basin has an area of about 3 million square miles, and this Alleghanian Foreland Basin was about that size also. This huge basin stretched all the way across the United States and into Arizona and New Mexico, and geologists have found sediments in those states that originated in the eastern U.S. at the Alleghanian Mountains. The main sediment that came out of these Himalayan-sized mountains was sand. Tons and tons and tons of sand that filled up completely the Foreland Basin and created a massive coastal plain that reached all the way to the western United States. This image by Dr. Ron Blakey shows how much of the Foreland Basin had been filled during Pennsylvanian time, and shows that this gigantic coastal plain reached all the way to West Texas. This is a picture of Pennsylvanian sandstone that came from the Georgia Cumberland Plateau. This picture shows the channel of a river abandoned and then filled up with sandstone. We are looking as if we are standing in the river looking up or downstream. This is conglomerate from the Pennsylvanian time period. Notice how the pebbles inside this conglomerate are smooth. That shows they spent a lot of time rolling and tumbling in the river. After millions of years of erosion by rivers, we are left with these fabulous sandstone cliffs depicted in these pictures from the Cumberland Plateau. This giant-sized coastal plain was laced with coastal plain rivers that had coastal plain swamps along their margins. In these swamps, very interesting exotic fern-like, cycad-like, lycopodium, horsetail kinds of plants grew in thickened abundance, very regularly due to cyclotherms relating to glaciers coming and going. Rivers would overflow their banks, covering these swamp forests with mud. And over many, many millions of years and many, many layers of mud, these deposits became coal. All over the world this happened, and most of the world's coal deposits were created during the Alleghanian Orogeny and during the Pennsylvanian period. Okay, rock buddies, there you have it, the Alleghanian Orogeny. I hope you liked this video. If so, please subscribe. And this is Papa saying to all my excellent rock buddies, happy rock hunting. Papa out.